David Brewster here with a new episode of Chordplay, and this is part 2 of I Love 90s Chords. And there's actually quite a few episodes like this on my channel. There's I Love 50s Chords and 60s Chords, 70s Chords. There's 2 episodes for I Love 80s Chords. This is technically the second 90s Chords episode. There's also 2 episodes for Headbanger's Ball floating around on my channel too. And I haven't put together a 21st Century Chords episode yet, but there is one coming. But the 90s was a really interesting decade in music, and it definitely seems like everybody talks about the grunge and alternative revolution, but there was a lot of other interesting things that happened, within the 90s. There was a huge blues rock explosion, prog rock and prog metal explosions. A lot of 70s artists had huge comebacks. Neil Young was labeled like the godfather of grunge. Zeppelin, Hendrix, and Black Sabbath and groups like that had a huge resurgence. So definitely, the 90s rocked. So I really like putting these episodes together because we can look at different groups and bands and guitarists and songs that maybe we wouldn't normally look at in an episode. Maybe some of these groups might be 1 or 2 hit wonders, or maybe they just didn't really have enough material for an entire episode. But I like hitting some of these, kind of elusive songs and some of the chords that are hiding in some of these songs, because definitely the 90s had a ton of interesting chords happening. There was a lot of dissonance and tension. Think of groups like Tool and Stone Temple Pilots and Soundgarden and some of those bands, and you can hear these really dark and dissonant intervals and dissonant chords. So the music in this episode is going to be pulled from 6 different albums from the 90s, and we're targeting, chords here. This is Chordplay, so I'm not really worried about hits or popular bands or anything like that. I'm worried about chords. So here we go. Or with the opening, that Shelf in the Room from the band Days of the New, kind of a late 90s explosion with that album. And it's interesting that not too long after you heard Jar of Flies from Alice in Chains and MTV's Unplugged series really started to heat up, then all of a sudden there was Days of the New, and it was like this heavy, noticeably a hard rock band, but they were unplugged, which was kind of their claim to fame. But for this song, we're basically tuned down a half step, and we're also in double drop D tuning. So tune everything down a half step, and then your low E and high E are both tuned to D, and you'll have something like this. So there's double drop D down a half step, and Shelf in the Room, like the first half, you've got this. Right? So it's like D, kind of an implied F6, and G major, also G sus4 right there. But that D, like that, the F6, like that, and then this G. And he keeps grabbing that C note and kind of pulling off to that B, which that's the, the sus4 right there in the key of G, that C note. You're going to do that pull off and then play the high E open, which is tuned to D, like that. Repeat it again. And that time you've got that little, and that's taking you back to that D, and then they start filling the chords out a little bit more, like this. D5 and that F6, and you're going to grab that high E right there and then move up to that G, and the second time right there you want to play that high E again like we did the first time, and then the last time here, and right there the last time they literally strum those chords, D5, F6 to that G major. Next up's the song Right Here, Right Now from the group Jesus Jones, and this was an early 90s hit, and I definitely remember watching MTV around that time, and they played this video all day, every day. And I never actually learned the guitar part of the song until I had a student that came in for a lesson, years later, and they asked for the song, like, hey, can we learn Right Here, Right Now? And then I sat and learned the guitar part and showed it to them. But I discovered it actually has a really cool guitar part. It's very simple. And I've mentioned this in other episodes here on this channel, but great songs and great guitar parts don't have to be hard to play. Sometimes these simple ideas lead to great things and hit songs, like this. So it starts with this D unison right there, just a fretted D with the open D. Then change that fretted D up to a G sharp with that open D. And then G natural with that open D. You got this little melodic fill. So it's right there with that open D string. The B and G note, and then A and F sharp. And then F and E. And just the last time right there, just play that F and E without the open D string. And then they move to this, and that's a glorified D octave right there. You know, it's the D unison with that higher D right there. And I like playing that with my pinky right here, because the next chord, you can actually slide into it with your third finger, and it makes the next chord a little easier, like this. Like that transition. Instead of doing this and then you have to flip everything, you can actually just have that third finger waiting for that note, and then you can move into that next chord a lot easier. So there you're moving that G sharp to G like we did in the beginning, but now you're doing it like that. And that same little melodic fill. Parts like that, where it's really simple, but it creates this texture and mood and tonality. Really cool. Next up's the song Love Is On The Way from the band Saigon Kick, and this came from their album The Lizard, and this has a very distinct and interesting chord progression. Something like this. That's a stretch right there. So that's a C sharp minor add 9, like that. So we've looked at add 9 chords a lot on my channel, and right there you can see we're using, you know, fretted notes mixed with open strings. Right? So the picking pattern, like that, you want to pick the fretted notes first, and then that backward kind of picking pattern. Right? And then it's an A sus2 right there. C sharp minor add 9 to A sus2. And it's this A sus2. It's a little different than the more traditional shape like that. They're doubling that B note right there. Right? And then you just kind of go back and forth. They'll sound so cool and kind of haunted. Really cool stuff. Next up's Can't Get You Off My Mind from Lenny Kravitz, and this came from his album Circus. And definitely those first 4, you know, Lenny Kravitz albums in the 90s were brilliant. Let Love Rule, Mama Said, Are You Gonna Go My Way, and Circus. And this is really interesting. There's a strummed acoustic, but it's the electric guitar playing these kind of fills using minor triads and shifting. It's really cool, like this. With this G, kind of aggressively strummed, and he's kind of playing around with that G chord. Kind of walking up right there, and then it's A minor. Look at A minor 7 right there. And that's like the middle part, that D, G, and B strings kind of slid back and forth. And then do the top part, like that, A minor, and then he adds the B note there, like an A minor 9. Right? And then back to that G, like that. Back to G. Back to A minor 7, that A minor. Then he moves way up here, grabs this A minor, and then that A minor. And I love that, where you can hear like 4 different flavors of A minor or A minor 7. You know, here's A minor 7, and then A minor, and then this inversion of A minor, and then that one. And I love that kind of weird, slippery, shifty sound. It sounds really good in there. And back to that G chord. So if you haven't heard that song for a while, listen to it again and check out that second guitar part with all those little like minor triad shifts and stuff. So cool. Next up's the original version of the song Hurt from 9 Inch Nails, and this came from their album The Downward Spiral. And definitely the Johnny Cash cover of this song seems to have eclipsed the original version because it's very popular. But I prefer the original 9 Inch Nails version. I think Trent Reznor's a genius. And this has this really unsettling, eerie, haunted, and kind of mysterious vibe, like this. That's a B sharp 11 right there. And you're really just playing, you know, this. So you're grabbing the root, the 5th, and then there's your sharp 11 right there with your pinky. And then it goes to a D sus2 right here. And then a very unusual E7. You're putting the 7 way up on top, that D note. Like that. Really unusual batch of chords right there. I mean, they normally wouldn't think those chords would work together, but when you hear that progression, it definitely has that flow to it. And the next time, start it the same, and then the D sus2. And it's kind of a hesitation on the E sus2 right here. Like the the root and the 5th, and then the sus2, that F sharp on top, and then you just loop all that again. Last but not least is the mighty Alice in Chains with their song I Stay Away, which came from the Jar of Flies EP. And this is a really interesting guitar part. We're tuned down a half step and then we're in drop D. So it's similar to where we started with Days of the New, which that was down a half step and double drop D. But this one's just regular drop D tuning down a half step. But I Stay Away is something like this. Actually playing this on a 12-string guitar, and I'm going to show you what he actually played on the 12-string, but then if you're playing this on a 6-string like I am, I'm going to supply you with a variation that actually sounds more like the album. So it's actually, you know, we're down a half step and then drop D, so you have this huge D sus2 to D major there in the beginning, and you're just kind of hammering on to that F sharp, you know, D sus2 to D major, like that, and then you have this. Going to function a couple different ways. How about a D7 sus4 right there, like that, and then you just distinctly hear this little kind of picked tag here. It's like a partial C, a partial like G over B. And you're grabbing that, which is really weird, kind of a big stretch there for your pinky too. And then open up that A string, and then just kind of come down like that. It's a really weird little fill. But then once you get that in there, it actually, you know, it fits perfectly. On a 12-string guitar. Now, I don't own anything 12-string, so there's a couple of ways you can kind of cheat this to where it sounds more like a 12-string. So instead of this, you can kind of fake it a little bit more like this. And to my ear, that sounds exactly like it, even though I'm not playing a 12-string guitar, because you're kind of missing those higher extensions in those chords when you do it this way. The alternative here, pun intended, but the alternative there's that, right? Same chords, basically D sus2 to D major, and then that's kind of a D7 sus4, like that, and then keep the other part the same. So that's kind of an interesting situation with this song. Like if you were playing in a cover band and you only had access to a 6-string guitar and you wanted to play this song, you're kind of faced with that dilemma, like, do I play it this way where it sounds right but not quite, or do I do it this other way which sounds more like the album? So you might find that when you're working on a song, maybe you're in a cover band or you're going to cover and record it or something on an album, you know, when you sit down and learn the guitar part, flesh things out and try things. You know, you could look for, you know, transcriptions of the song like out of a book or something, and if it doesn't quite jive with what you're hearing, then sit there and try to figure out, like, okay, am I missing like some of these extensions, or, you know, an upper part of the chord, or a root note, or a lower part? And there's a lot you can do to kind of fine tune the chords when you're working on a song. All right, that's going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with part 2 of I Love 90s Chords. And definitely there's something interesting about that decade. Really, there's interesting things with any decade of music, whether it's the 1930s or the 1990s or 2010s or whatever. You know, music is very interesting in a historical, you know, point of view when you really dive in there and notice, you know, trends and habits, and, you know, it could be tunings or effects or something like that, a certain amp, a certain guitar, a certain habit of playing, you know, the instrument. It just depends. Like when you kind of step back and look at an overview of a decade, you start to notice those things, like, hey, that idea pops up in like 10 different songs and it's just in that one decade. It's interesting. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.